Okay, guys, so our learning target for today is I can draw conclusions as I read a passage. So just like we've been doing, as I go through the lesson, I want you to follow along word for word and fill in the blanks in your notes. All right? So let's get started. Sometimes a writer does not state things directly about characters, events, and situations. Instead, a writer gives clues and details. To draw a conclusion, you can combine these clues and hints with what you already know. The idea you form is a conclusion. A conclusion is a reasonable judgment you form based on details you read. To draw a conclusion, first, think about what you already know about a subject. Then, think about what you learned by reading. Put them together to make a reasonable judgment. Now, this is very similar to making an inference, okay? And this is off the notes. I just want to remind you, an inference is an educated guess about what you're reading based on your background knowledge, what you already know, and what you are seeing in the text. So drawing a conclusion is going to be a very similar concept. All right, let's keep going. So we're going to read this paragraph, and I want you to draw a conclusion about what the speaker's job is. I stopped my patrol car when the call came in. It was 5:30 p.m., just after sunset. Bright lights were coming on everywhere. The city looked busy. The radio crackled. I heard my dispatcher's voice. Head over to the west side, Al said. 125th Street. A woman just called. She says a cougar jumped into her basement. So let's think about it. 1. I know that police officers have equipment like patrol cars and radios. I also know that police officers are supposed to protect people. 2. I can tell by reading that the speaker has a patrol car and radio. I also read that the speaker has to look for a cougar. 3. I can conclude that the speaker is a police officer. Graphic organizers. So now graphic organizers can help you draw conclusions. In the first box, write things you already know about the subject. In the second box, write details you learned by reading. And write your conclusion in the last box. So now we're going to read a couple sentences. And I want you to think about what is one conclusion you can draw about the danger of giant African land snails. All right, so let's go ahead and read. Giant African land snails multiply quickly if they get out into the wild. Their extraordinary appetites make them a threat to farm crops. So let's think about it. In the first box, what I already know. Well, an animal's appetite means how much it can eat. In the second box, what I learned, snails' appetites make them a threat to crops. And my conclusion, the last box, giant African land snails could threaten the food supply. I'm going to say that one more time. Conclusion, giant African land snails could threaten the food supply. So let's review. As you read, you can draw a conclusion. Use things you already know and clues and details the writer provides. Combine these together to make a decision or form an idea about characters, events, and situations. Review the steps you can use to draw a conclusion. Think about things you already know about a topic. Note the details and clues as you read. Combine details from the text with things you know. All right, so let's practice. We're going to go ahead and read this passage, and we're going to think about some things as we go. Basement Beastie. I stopped my patrol car when the call came in. It was 5:30 p.m., just after sunset. Bright lights were coming on everywhere. The city looked busy. The radio crackled. I heard my dispatcher's voice. "Head over to the west side," Al said. 125th Street. A woman just called. She says a cougar jumped into her basement. So let's think about this really quickly, guys. Picture the setting that is described. I want you to visualize it. Then picture where a cougar might live. All right? So when you think about it, this sounds kind of like it's a city, right? When I read about the bright lights coming on everywhere and the city looking busy, I have this image in my mind of a place like New York, you know? And then when I picture where a cougar might live, I think of the mountains. A cougar's a mountain lion. So I think the wild. So this is not a place where someone would expect to find a cougar. So let's keep reading. "I'm sure it's just a dog," I said, shaking my head. "You can tell her that when you get there, Bob," he said. "She swears it's a cougar." All right, so now I want you to form a mental image of Bob talking to Al. Imagine what Bob looks like as Al answers. I know that personally, if I really thought this was unlikely, I would kind of have my eyebrows furrowed and maybe be shaking my head a little. Okay, so that's kind of what I have going on in my mind when I think about this conversation. Let's keep going. "I found the address and parked my car. A woman was on the stoop holding a broom. She pointed at a broken window on the side of the building. 'It went in there,' she shouted." I chuckled. If it had really been a cougar, that broom sure wasn't going to keep her safe. So think about the details. I want you to picture what Bob sees. He just pulled up. There's this lady on her porch with a broom. There's a broken window. And she's swearing it's a cougar. Okay? So I just want you to think about that scene that he's witnessing right now. I grabbed my flashlight and knelt next to the window. "Here?" I asked. She nodded. As I peered in, I heard a low growl. The hair on my neck stood up. This was no dog. So now notice the clues. The animal growls, the hair on Bob's neck stands up, and the animal is not a dog. So let's practice drawing a conclusion. What conclusion can you draw about how Bob feels when he says, "I'm sure it's just a dog"? A. Bob thinks dogs are funny. B. Bob wants Al to be his friend. C. Bob doesn't believe she saw a cougar. Or D. Bob wants to cover up the fact that he's scared. So think about the things you already know as you read. Well, I know that people shake their heads when they think something is wrong. In fact, that was something I mentioned when we were reading. So review the passage to find details. Well, when I reread this part of the passage, I can form a mental image of Bob shaking his head when he answers owl. Remember, I was talking about that. We were imagining what that might look like, that whole scene, because Bob seemed pretty unsure. So he was shaking his head. I imagined his eyes being furrowed. So if we reread the passage, we can actually find these details. And then combine the details in the passage with what you already know, kind of like making an inference. Well, I can conclude that Bob believes the woman is wrong. So that means the answer would be C. Bob doesn't believe she saw a cougar. So now I'm going to read these questions to you, and I want you to go ahead and answer them in your packet. So same thing, go back, look at the passage. So you'll want to rewind the video and maybe pause and use that to help you answer these questions. 1. The woman is holding the broom. A. To protect herself from the cougar. B. To clean up the front stoop. C. To show it to Bob. Or D. To lean on it like a crutch. 2. When does Bob change his opinion about what the woman probably saw? A. When he gets the call from Al. B. When he sees the broom the woman is holding. C. When he arrives in the neighborhood. Or D. When he hears the animal growl. 3. Which sentence supports the conclusion that Bob became scared when he looked in the window? A. It went in there, she shouted. B. The hair on my neck stood up. C. I stopped my patrol car when the call came in. Or D. As I peered in, I heard a low growl. And 4. If the story continues, what is most likely to happen next? A. Bob sees a dog. B. Bob sees a cougar. C. Bob jumps into the basement. Or D. Bob leaves without helping. All right, make sure you've got these questions answered in your packet. So let's move on. Let's practice another one. This one is titled Slime City. Now I want you to read the title and look at the picture. I want you to think about this. What do you think the article is about? So it's called Slime City, and over here, our picture, we see some snails. So what do you think this article is about? How big are giant African land snails? Their shells can grow up to 10 inches long, and their bodies can stretch 15 long, slimy inches. These creatures are becoming popular as pets in some parts of the world, but don't jump at the idea of owning one. These snails are illegal in the United States. Sometimes called gals, these enormous shell dwellers are dangerous. Many of them are infected with a disease. It's called rat lungworm, and it can make humans very sick. Giant African land snails multiply quickly if they get out into the wild. Their extraordinary appetites make them a threat to farm crops. Now, I want to take a moment. What might make a snail's appetite extraordinary? So that means we're going to have to think about what this word means. So let's break it apart. It looks like it's a bit of a compound word here. So extraordinary. So I know if I'm thinking about my roots, I know that extra means more than, all right? And then ordinary means kind of regular. So more than regular. So when I put this together, I can infer that the word extraordinary means more than normal, okay? So more than what would be seen as regular. So what would make a snail's appetite more than normal? So what would make it seem bigger than a regular snail's appetite? And I want you to think, have you ever seen anything extraordinary? Okay, just think about that. In the 1960s, Florida had to spend $1 million to solve a gal's problem. To avoid a similar disaster, many states issued alerts in 2004. They warned people to be on the lookout for a snail invasion. Wisconsin issued so many alerts that the first half of the year was dubbed the Great Snail Hunt of 2004. But it's not just Florida and Wisconsin that are on the alert. States from Maryland to Michigan worry about the snails. If you know of a giant African land snail, report it to the proper authorities. Whatever you do, don't let it escape. So what details in the article can you put together to draw a conclusion about what might happen if a giant land snail escaped? So I want you to think about what details in the article can you put together to draw a conclusion about what might happen if a giant land snail escaped. Well, when I look at this, I noticed that it said they multiply quickly if they get out into the wild. So that tells me if these snails escaped, they might quickly reproduce. So what might have been one or two snails might quickly be 20, 30, 40 plus. I also see that they have extraordinary appetites that make them a threat to farm crops. So that tells me another conclusion I can make is that if giant land snails escaped, they would eat a lot of these crops and probably cost the farmers lots of money. So these are some conclusions I can come to. Now, I want you to answer the questions in your packet, right? So you'll need to go look at those on your own and answer those questions. When you finish that packet, you are going to turn it into the turn-in bin, and then you are going to go to Coach Digital and complete the assignment there, all right? After you finish that, I want you to go ahead and complete any other Coach Digital assignments that may not be finished yet. And then you're going to move on to the IXL skills that are on the board. All right, guys, great job. And let's get to work.